a reset, but this reset is different than all the other resets, and I'll tell you why. It's very important. Um, this reset, because of digital technology, they can literally end currency and implement a financial control grid, which is the equivalent of slavery. We are evolving from a central banking warfare model, with markets and capitalism to a control grid that basically is turns the I use Whitney Webb's word, it turns the planet into a panopticon. If that's a crime, Trump's going to jail.
Yeah.
I've never met a more anti-capitalist. He is our most anti-capitalist president yet.
Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. I have Catherine Austin Fitts joining me today for a very important conversation, something that I've been reviewing and seeing and discussing in different ways, but really kind of dove into recently with an article written from Gen X Girl for The Last American Vagabond entitled How American Tax Dollars Prop Up Israel's Zombie Economy. So I decided to invite, obviously, the best person to have this conversation with in the financial field, Catherine Austin Fitts, and discuss what that is in general, a little bit maybe on the zombie economy, but more so about the Israel bonds conversation and how that's affecting the American economy, and discuss that, how it ties into a lot of different discussions, including the broader topic of whether the country itself, through many different points, but Donald Trump himself being anti-capitalist. And maybe that point coming out, like talking about, I argue, the kind of undermining of the long-term duopoly of a lot of conversations. And we've talked a lot about fascism and socialism and the allegations and how a lot of ways it seems to be kind of joining together. And so we're going to talk with Catherine about what that is, why that's happening, and what we can see and where that seems to be aiming. So Catherine, thank you for joining us today. How are you?
Oh, it's great to join you, and it's great to see you this weekend. I
Yes.
have the most beautiful watermelon sitting in my kitchen. I love watermelon, and that is the biggest, heaviest water. That's the heaviest watermelon I've ever seen. All I can say is your garden has a lot of water. Yeah.
Thank you. Lots of love. Yeah, I know. I'm very proud of the watermelons we're growing back there, but thank you. Yeah, I had a great time to Crossing Creeks Farms. I actually just gave a big shout out in the show as well. It was a really, we've been there for many events. That one was very profound to me for many reasons. And I really thought
wasn't it beautiful?
Yes. And it was more, obviously it's always an amazing place. It really is just a beautiful place, but your conversation about where this is going and people's investments, important part for the conversation today, being tied in with kind of building the digital grid while wanting to fight it. And this kind of contradictory moment where there's a lot of people doing that because, as you said, it's very lucrative right now for people to be invested in these larger funds and not realizing they're building their own cage, so it's an important moment.
Right. And a beautiful, beautiful day. Tennessee's a beautiful place.
I've been in a lot of places and it is my favorite. I mean, I lived in Hawaii for 2 years and I think I would still choose Tennessee right now. Obviously for plenty of other reasons as well, as we both choose it. But so let's start with, the general conversation of what, Israel bonds, the discussion of what that is for people that don't know. I mean, I myself am very, I'm on the lighter end of understanding a lot of these financial points and what it means, and then get into the point that I want to get into is how essentially it seems Americans are being forced to do this, even though it seems to be losing the money, and what that really shows us.
So what you're watching, both through the U.S. budget and the federal credit, and now through steering of people's investments, you're seeing a hijacking of our financial resources and assets, I would say, to serve a distinctly anti-American, anti-capitalist group. I mean, I make no bones about it. I think the people, Netanyahu and his clan are basically a criminal syndicate. And I don't think they have any religious or moral philosophies. And if you look at the extent to which we are pouring money into financing the Holocaust in Gaza, or financing all sorts of shenanigans by this group, it's extraordinary. And as you can see, there's more and more indication of lawlessness in the way that they affect our governance structure, from the refusal to release the Epstein files, which I would put right at the top of this challenge, to APAC basically controlling congressmen to having people in both the executive branch and congressional branch have dual citizen passports,
Mm.
and terrible conflicts of interest. So we're literally watching the American government hijacked by private and foreign interests in a way that is very anti-American, very anti-capitalism, and very much, in many respects, I would say, against the law.
Yeah, very much so.
So, and this Israeli bond situation in Florida is an example of trying to make something legal that is clearly not legal.
Mhm.
If you look at all of the history of the investment of taxpayers' money through the pension funds or through the state and local budgets, there is a lot of history of something called the prudent man rule and fiduciary obligation. And you are never supposed to invest in anything that a prudent man wouldn't do. And of course, one of the ways that government officials tell the difference between prudent and non-prudent is through bond ratings. And what we've seen in the last 20 years is the Department of Justice politicized bond ratings. They,
Right.
in you know, after the financial crisis, when Standard and Poor's tried to drop the U.S. bond rating, Department of Justice went after their holding company and almost destroyed it. And so the clear message was, ratings are political. But now what we see is bonds that don't make the investment grade rating. And now we see DeSantis, unfortunately, passing and signing a law, the Florida legislature and DeSantis, basically making it possible for local authorities to invest in these bonds. And if you look at the amount of money that you've reported they're putting in, this is really taking from the poor and giving to the rich.
Right.
And I know the biggest position is in Palm Beach, and there are many, many wealthy people in Palm Beach, but there are also taxpayers in Palm Beach who are not wealthy. And this is a very disturbing, because what we're talking about is we've watched a steady collapse of our financial controls in the United States. And it started with the financial collapse of the US government finances.
Mm.
So the US government is clearly operating way outside the financial management laws. We've seen a refusal to produce audited financial statements as required by law. And now we've seen the government in 2018 adopt an administrative policy that says we can keep secret books.
Right.
Now, an administrative policy cannot overrule the Constitution and the laws and the regulations. It's junior to all three of those layers, and yet they're doing it because Congress and the executive branch agree that they can do it, and no one, Congress has the power of the purse, so they can turn off the money and say, unless we get audited financial statements, no appropriation for you, or we cut your appropriations by a certain amount. It was really funny. Warren Buffett said the other day, it's real easy if you want to balance the budget. Just say that, if the deficit is more than 3% of GDP, all incumbents get thrown out of office. He said they'll balance it real quick.
Right.
Right. Right.
I was gonna say that point goes for so many other things as well, right? I mean, if you put their money, have them have personal responsibility in these actions, and you see things change very quickly. And you pointed out that in Florida, as well as Pennsylvania and plenty of other states, they've passed laws that make it prohibit the divestment from these, even though they're losing money. And it just seems like it seems criminal, as you were saying.
To me, this is criminal.
Yeah.
This is a complete violation of fiduciary obligation, and this is happening at the same time. If you look at what's happening in the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and all sorts of areas related to financial management, what we're seeing is basically a new philosophy that we don't have to obey the law. We can just, it's break things and move fast. It's the tech model of we don't need to pay attention to any of those things. I don't know if you saw the Attorney General's testimony recently.
Yep.
It was amazing because basically what I heard, my impression is her saying, look, we don't have to obey the law, and we're going to do whatever we want. If you don't like it, tough.
Right.
I mean, there's this feeling that the political power rests with the criminal syndicate, and the criminal syndicate can do whatever they want. And as long as if you do what they want, you're protected. I mean, it's a and the clear mess. This is not just in the domestic area. This is international too.
Mm-hmm.
So all over the world, and that was the message of shutting down USAID. USAID was basically soft power. You go into a country and you buy everybody, including with all these ridiculous things. Now we're saying, okay, we got the Palantir system. We can manhunt and kill you, and now we're going to a a hard power system.
Well, let me ask you something in regard to the point you made in the beginning, which I completely agree with. Is so it's very clear if anybody's being objective and honest about this, that Israel, as well as other moneyed interest lobbying group, maybe other countries, are influencing policy in this country very clearly. So, but as you highlighted there, is it your opinion, or how do you see that ultimately that became the reality because of, let's say, Israel manufacturing that, or more so that the U.S. government, through, I guess, just profiteering, opened that door to outside interest using lobbying to basically take control, that allowed that, and Israel just took advantage? You see what I'm saying?
So,
like, which way do you look at that?
So I would say Israel is a portion, and I don't want to say Israel because Israel's a country full of many
Right,
people.
right.
We're talking about a syndicate that runs Israel that is essentially American.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Netanyahu. I grew up in Philadelphia. Netanyahu went to Cheltenham High. He's a graduate of Cheltenham High in Philadelphia. And I could have told you never give a nuclear arsenal to anybody who graduated from Cheltenham High. Just don't do that. Okay. Then he went to MIT, went back to Israel to be in the military. Then he came back to MIT. Netanyahu is not a Middle East guy. He's,
Right.
in my book, he's an American. And I think he's gone in and out of citizenship several times. But, if you look at who runs Israel, it's the United States, or it's mega donors, mega rich in the United States. So my framework is this is the mega rich against everyone else. And this infrastructure has been growing steadily since the creation of the national security state in 47 and 49. And what we've done is we have taken secret government programs and money,
Mm-hmm.
and secret behavior by the Federal Reserve and the CIA, who's very much in the lead here, U.S. intelligence agencies, and we've centralized more and more economic and political power. And one of the ways we've done that is by basically running economic hits all around the world. So we're
Mm-hmm.
just publishing our new wrap up on plunder, and it gives chapter and verse. And one of the things you would hear the people doing those economic hits all around the world is eventually we're going to have to come back and do our domestic populations.
Mm-hmm.
And now what you're watching is you're watching a process happening in both Europe and the United States and the G7 nations, where they are now plundering their own populations because they got their what whooped in the Ukraine, and now they can't plunder Russia. So now we're coming home and plundering home base.
Right, exactly. Which, arguably, like you said, was always the plan. And I think it's important to overlap with this as well before we get into the more other aspects of, like, the lie about capital, or rather Trump being anti-capitalist. There's an overlap to this in regard to the universities, constitutional actions like BDS as well, that ultimately the argument that the Gen X girl makes as well on the article, but I've seen many other reports about it, is that so we had the BDS movement getting a lot of traction. And and this even overlaps, by the way, with the TikTok point, as Glenn Greenwald points out, that there was really two main elements that was, the largest issues. There's plenty more, but that was the campus protests and awareness through that Greenblatt said himself, it's a generational problem, and then TikTok. And both of them effectively have been dealt with through Donald Trump's actions. And it's not just a left-right thing, but go ahead.
So let's look at TikTok.
Mm-hmm. Well,
So
let me make one really quickly. The point I was going to make, and then we'll go to TikTok, was simply that the argument was from the bond side of it that here's an actual article from Times of Israel making this exact point, that hey, we're going to do this as an alternative to BDS, and they literally called it, what was it called right here? The bonds donated to schools. And the point was they donated these to schools knowing that schools weren't allowed to basically divest from them to a certain period of time. Then they were locked in and were able to divest. And so it's a deliberate effort from the Israeli government to sort of undermine the constitutional rights of individuals and the ability to divest. And so TikTok is a similar overlap. But go ahead. I just want to make that point about how coercive that is.
Right. So when the TikTok brouhaha started, the problem was so let me talk about Gaza. A lot of times I'll refer to Gaza as a Holocaust,
Mm-hmm.
but let me refer to Gaza as a real estate development.
Okay.
I mean, if you look at the peace plan, It's pretty clear. It's a real estate development.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you take a piece of land, you clean off by killing or moving the people who are on it. You take the oil and gas, you take the water, and you decimate the infrastructure, and you do all of that with taxpayers' money, right?
Right. Right.
And then so now you've got a clean slate. You come back in, and suddenly Donald Trump and Tony Blair are in charge of the new place. And then you say, oh, let's fix Gaza. And you bring in lots of taxpayers' money and you build it up, except now you and your pals own it. Right. So it's a taking.
Right.
It's a
And they've been
taking.
clear about that. I mean, they've publicly been praising the idea of the real estate deal that it is.
Right. So they've been very clear. Now, the problem on TikTok was it was interfering with the real estate development.
Mm.
Right. That's
Mm-hmm.
you're a group of people and you're trying to take control of land for free and you're getting interrupted. Right. And TikTok was interrupting you. It was making it, it was threatening your ability to assert control of the real estate. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So TikTok had to be dealt with. Now, here's what you need to know looking at the sort of holding company and ownership structure. At the time that they said TikTok was a problem, TikTok was not owned by the Chinese. 20% was owned by the Chinese founders and employees, and they had operational control. But you had 45% or more that was owned by US private equity firms, including KKR.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So their problem wasn't ownership, it was operational. They wanted to be able to openly censor.
Right.
Right? So basically you have the US government and Congress step in and force a shift of control of TikTok. That's a taking.
Yeah. And
That
under the
is
argument that it was foreign influence when all you did was ultimately hand it over to a different kind of foreign influence.
I'm sorry,
Wasn't there
when
to begin with.
American private equity firms own the majority of the equity, not the
Mm.
Chinese, that is not foreign influence. I mean, I'm not saying that
Right.
there isn't foreign influence, but excuse me, we're talking about going in and saying, okay, in the United States, even though we pretend to have the biggest capital markets in the world, you can't trust us because we feel free to take your stuff if you're in the US capital markets.
Right.
Right? That's what they're saying. They're saying there's no law in the US capital markets. If you don't do what we say, we take your stuff. Okay. So one thing led to another, and we engineer a transfer of TikTok into the control of one of the richest people in the world. Okay. So whether it's, Musk coming in and taking all the data or Larry Ellison picking up TikTok, what do we see? We're back to the billionaires who are friendly or part of the syndicate, getting windfalls in takings.
Mhm.
Is what we're seeing.
Right.
Okay. So Ellison takes over TikTok within 12 hours. If you go to TikTok and you put in my name, it will say, no response because this is in violation of violence standards and community standards and whatever. So I'm completely shadow banned from TikTok.
Right.
The Solari Report channel is still there, but you can't find it unless you know how to find it. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's what they're doing. They're taking assets and then they're turning around and they're doing that at the same time. What else is happening? Netanyahu has a big meeting. He hires Trump's former campaign manager for 1.5 million a month and starts pumping out huge and hideous budgets for influencers across the media, both corporate media and alternative media, to be paid to post pro-Israeli things.
Not even hiding it.
From the minute that turned on, you wouldn't believe the tsunami of garbage
Mm-hmm.
that I've been receiving. It's unbelievable.
Receiving how? You mean but in your feed or being sent?
Being sent with emails in
Interesting.
various feeds,
Hmm.
it's coming in all directions. And what I will tell you, knowing a lot of people in the alternative media, they don't know where this is coming from.
Hmm.
In other words, so you got one group that suddenly, because last year, you have to have foreign boogeyman. Last year was the Chinese. The Chinese were the foreign boogeyman, but that was wearing thin. Now, I go to a meeting yesterday. There are 1,000 Al Qaeda cells from Islam, and Islam is the danger. And, we have to be ready to defend ourselves against Islam. Now, I don't disagree that there aren't serious migration problems
Right.
coming out of Islam, or that there aren't serious issues here.
Mm-hmm.
And I just turned around, and this is a very well-educated, prosperous person from Tennessee. I just looked at them and I said, let me explain how this works. If you look at the over $1 trillion military and intelligence budget, there is no one from Muslim countries in this country who isn't financed, tracked, identified, controlled, and managed by the U.S. intelligence agencies. So if there are 1,000 Al Qaeda cells, who do you think they work for?
Right.
And who do you think can kick them out in a flat second? I mean, we're talking about living in a panopticon here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And if you don't understand that after Palantir, so the notion that suddenly we got to worry about the Islamic boogeyman. And I just said to them, look, the problem you have to worry about is that your Congress is controlled by foreign interests. Listen to Tucker Carlson. Your military, you have Israeli IDF military in the Pentagon in the middle of a war, telling the Pentagon what to do and screaming at them and treating them like, doo-doo squad.
I have a video, by the way, we can play since I was just talking about this last night. Very short. This is from before this current focus. And I'll add, by the way, to what you were saying, that I think it's very, very obvious, and this is why they're sort of in damage control, that the right very clearly, but I think both sides of the paradigm are very, very vocal and very aware that Israel is the largest issue in all that. And I think they're just kind of scrambling to try to cover that up. Like Luna basically just tried to argue that like China was responsible for Charlie Kirk's death and so on, despite not being proven in any case. I think it's interesting that there's a lot of effort to distract from that. Here is Wilkerson speaking to going underground about how the Israel controls the Pentagon. This is before, I believe this was even before October 7th he's referring to. Well, obviously because it's his administration, but I'm not sure if the interview was then before. Well, let's play it.
That the Epstein business was heavily influenced, let me put it that way, by Mossad.
And so that's somehow emblematic on these huge geopolitical issues.
Yes, I watched Mossad take over the Pentagon. In 2002, the Pentagon was infiltrated by Mossad. They did not need any identification to get through the river entrance of the building. They went upstairs to Douglas Feith, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, the third most powerful man in the Defense Department. Occasionally, they went to the second most powerful man, Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and they had run of the Pentagon. Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, said to my boss one time, "Hell, I don't run my building. Mossad does."
Wild.
Okay, so I was just saying this on Money and Markets. If you want to do something to turn America back to a successful country, economically or politically, one of the most important things you want is the Epstein files released.
Right.
Okay. If a criminal syndicate can control your government using control files, then there's no hope. So get those Epstein files released. I don't know if you just saw Howard Lutnick's latest interview.
Oh, maybe not actually.
Okay, so Howard Lutnick, Secretary of Commerce, gives an interview saying that Epstein, even though he was a next door neighbor and shared a wall,
oh, I did see that one,
gave him the creeps, and he couldn't believe it. But other people fell for it because they wanted the massages and they went along. And that included Bill Gates. So he added Bill Gates as going along with the massage. Okay, right. So now we have Howard Lutnick implying that Bill Gates is a pedophile, or certainly sleeping with underage children. And then he says that Epstein was rich because he ran the most successful blackmail syndicate in history. Now, I would say it's because he ran one of the most successful money laundering things in history, but let's put that aside. So Howard Lutnick says that Epstein was a violent criminal, right? So he's trafficking children who are being raped, right? And he's blackmailing leaders. Okay, so we're talking about a major criminal conspiracy, according to the Secretary of Commerce. But meantime, the president and the attorney general are telling us we have no files, which we know is a complete lie.
Right.
because
Even Massey.
right, the compensation fund created after Epstein died from his estate allocated 140 million to 138 victims, or 138 million to 140 victims. So it's about $1 million per. Now you don't give 140 people $1 million per if there's no there.
Right.
Right.
And I
Okay.
was going to say that Massey and Congress laid out the 20 names that they have access to, the lies from Cash. Like there's no denying that they're trying to hide this right now.
Well, it gets better. Mike Johnson is refusing
Right.
to swear in the 218th vote. So we have a congresswoman who now just won in a special election. We know she's going to vote for Massey's petition. She's going to put it over the top. Mike Johnson refuses to swear her in.
Right.
I mean, there are people who are calling this the Epstein shutdown.
Yeah. I mean,
Right.
he alluded to that beforehand, in fact. I very much think that's at least a large part of why this is happening. And on top of that, I get the sense that what we're watching is that being one side of it. If they can only stretch that as long as they can. I think the point is that's the holding point. I'm arguing that they're probably going after one of the Republicans, like Nancy Mace, for example, to get her to change. Then they won't have it either way. That's what I think is happening.
So what we saw was, you had, I don't know if you saw the judge whose house blew up in South Carolina.
Did. Yeah.
But the gloves are coming off and the signals are always, if you oppose us, here's what happens. So let's look on September 10th. What happened on September 10th?
In regard to Charlie Kirk?
So you had the Charlie Kirk assassination event.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What else happened on September 10th afterwards?
What happened?
The Senate voted to not release the Epstein files.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What a coincidence.
Right.
Right. So back to a criminal syndicate controlling the country. So that is clearly outside the law. It is clearly criminal. And these things, but at the same time, if you're a state or local official, you don't want your house blown up. Right?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Obviously.
But the next thing you know, you're legislating things that give to the syndicate our money. So it's a bank robbery by blackmail.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
Right.
so how does the Epstein overlap tie into the financial side of it all? I mean, you made the case already about the money laundering, but go deeper on that and why that connects.
Well, Epstein goes to the White House, according to Whitney Webb, in 1994. And if you want to understand Epstein, you really have to read Whitney Webb's books and
I agree.
materials that all rolled out on your wonderful website. But so Epstein is taken by Bob Rubin, who's the National Economic Advisor, later Secretary of the Treasury. So Bob takes Epstein to the White House in 1994, introduces him to Clintons. Before the Clintons leave, he's gone to the White House many, many, many times. Whitney has the numbers in her books, but it's extraordinary. And then in 1997, beginning of fiscal 1998, we have Rubin go over to Treasury. Forget exactly when he goes over, but Rubin goes over to Treasury. He brings in Gary Gensler from Goldman Sachs, his old partner from Goldman Sachs, and suddenly 21 trillion starts disappearing from the federal government. Then Clinton leaves the White House and proceeds to get in a plane with Epstein, and they start flying around the world where huge and hideous amounts of money start being donated back to places like the Clinton Foundation and the Gates Foundation. Where'd that money really come from?
Clearly from the operation, it sounds.
I have all sorts of theories, and we have no proof.
Mm-hmm.
But when $21 trillion goes missing here, the offshore havens explode in price. The BIS and the New York Fed grow much, much closer. And then suddenly huge and hideous amounts of money mysteriously show up, donated to all these foundations who are implementing control and social control. The coincidence is remarkable.
Yeah. Well, is this where the FASB 56 part comes into play in regard to the black books or the dark books?
Right. So here's what happened. So in 1998, I started to see the money disappearing, including from HUD. So Rubin's over at Treasury, and vast amounts of money start disappearing from both HUD and DOD. As of 9/11, remember, the day before 9/11, Rumsfeld admitted at a press conference that 2.3 trillion had gone missing the prior year. So we started to bring pressure because I'd been part of a group of people in the first Bush administration who had gotten laws passed requiring audited financial statements. And a process had begun where the federal government would start to publish something saying we can't produce audited financial statements. And one of the problems is we have this undocumentable adjustments, that undocumentable adjustments. I never worked at the Pentagon, but I was the Assistant Secretary of Housing at HUD. And what I know is that's impossible. You look at the amount of money, there's almost $1 trillion now missing from HUD. It's impossible.
Mhm.
By the time I left the Federal Housing Administration, everything was computerized. You had plenty of resources. You had plenty of smart people. You had plenty of contracting authority. There's no reason their books weren't perfect.
Right.
Okay.
They're
It's just
covering up crime.
there's no way that happens unless you are doing illegal transactions.
Right.
That
Right.
there's no way. Okay. So this goes on and on and on for many years. And in 2015, we have 6.5 trillion missing in 1 year.
Hmm.
And of course, every year all along, I'm trying to raise the red flags and warn people about this because I know if you steal this much from our retirement funds, the only way you can balance the books is by lowering life expectancy.
Right.
And in fact, the great poisoning had started and they were lowering life expectancy, but it's accelerated dramatically with the pandemic on.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That I think that's really important not to brush over for people to pay attention to the timing of that, and then we fall into the COVID-19 illusion, which is exactly what you've been saying the entire time. That at least one of the large byproducts, which seemed by design, was the lowering of life expectancy, which is
if you look at life expectancy in the 20 industrialized countries, exactly when the financial coup starts, you see the life expectancy in the U.S. diverge from the other 19, and it diverges slowly, and then it falls off the cliff in the pandemic.
Right. And so
if you look at the policies implementing the great poisoning, it's intentional. It's a plan.
Right.
Not an accident.
Right.
Okay. So anyways, so we have this money going missing, and so because of the 2015 or the attention given, Dr. Mark Skidmore did a survey that we published in 2017, and I had identified, as of the 6.5 trillion, 12 trillion missing. He went back with his students and did a complete survey of all the DoD and HUD documents and calculated 21 trillion of undocumentable adjustments. Okay. Wow. So now we're talking, it's exactly what a Senate appropriations staff said to me long ago. They said, HUD is being run as a criminal enterprise. Now, HUD can't be run as a criminal enterprise unless the Treasury, the Department of Justice, the DoD, and the New York Fed run it as a criminal enterprise. It's a matrix structure. Okay, so at that point, a lot of attention gets brought to the fact that DoD continually has promised and then refused to produce audited financial statements, and there's unbelievable unanswered questions. Everything comes to a head, and the solution is, during the Kavanaugh hearings, right in the middle of the Kavanaugh hearings, they slip out a new policy that I think they thought no one would catch, but we caught it. It was called Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board Statement 56, and what it said is a secret group of people, by a secret process, could take a secret amount of the financial information and move it into a secret set of books. So the federal government can keep two sets of books, and no one can know who's deciding this, on what criteria, how much has been moved out. And then if you throw in, and this applies not just to the 24 covered agencies, but another 150 related sort of corporations or agencies or entities, and then with the national security and classification laws, voila, it also applies to the big banks and defense contractors and IT companies that do business with the federal government. So now, Ryan, we're looking at a situation where the American stock and bond market essentially have no meaningful disclosure.
And one thing I always point out is that, so essentially what they did right there was, there's an issue that people are acknowledging and say, okay, we'll do something about the issue. And instead of doing something about the issue, they just make it so it's not seen, or somehow it's legalized, or, they did this Ron Paul used to often make this point where they just go, okay, now it's legal, so no problem, right? It's just very,
Yeah, but here's the thing: an administrative policy cannot overrule the Constitution,
right.
the law, and regulations. It's junior to all those things. So we have an excellent article called Caveat Emptor, where I explain what this means to investors. And this is also, remember, part and parcel where the rating agencies can't do anything because the Department of Justice has made it clear if you drop our rating, we'll get you. Now, Moody's just dropped the rating a little bit. So apparently a little bit is being allowed. But this is extraordinary because let me give you an example. So for 10 years, I was an investment advisor after I settled the litigation with the Department of Justice. And people kept coming to me to help me clean them up from financial fraud like Madoff or other frauds and protect them from fraud. But they also wanted to get away from the digital control grid. And I kept telling them, there's no way. There's no like going to Switzerland and getting away from this. If you don't push back and stop it, we're all going to be slaves. It was one of the reasons I stopped. But I turned the company in 2018 into an investment screen company. So we screen stocks for a money manager who has a fund. And basically, he can only he doesn't have to buy or sell what we approve, but he can only buy or sell from the list of what we approve. And one of the things we do is we do everything we can to not approve companies that are highly dependent on federal government contracts, subsidies, whatever, because I have no idea what their disclosure means.
Right.
I look at their disclosure and I'm like, I have no idea. All I know is they are highly dependent on a political entity that is operating outside the law, and that operating outside the law is getting worse and worse every day.
So from like a food, like the making money standpoint, is that worry that the unknown can cause that to maybe collapse, or just that there's an illegal issue that you don't want to be a part of, or is it both?
So I'm worried that, the problem with being highly dependent on a political, a small number of clients who are very political is, you can get whacked way around. So we saw some of the big contractors during the initial part of a transition can see their stock way down and their revenues way down because they're in favor or out of favor, depending on which part of the union party they work with. So part of it is you're politically dependent. But the other problem is, there is more and more pressure on you to do things which are clearly illegal.
Right.
And because you're so dependent, you can get pushed into doing things that are illegal. And so we try to avoid that. So we're looking for real companies that do productive things that help people, that their relationship with their employees and their customers and the people in their vendors is lawful and productive. We want real companies that do real things, and there are many of them. I mean, it's a big world, and we still have a lot of companies that are great. What was very sad is after the pandemic, I had to throw about 80 companies off because they had just conducted themselves during the pandemic in a way which was exceptionally harmful to their employees and their customers.
Right.
I mean, life-threatening.
Yeah, right. And a lot of that, and in no way is this like a removal of accountability, but as you likely know, a lot of that was coercive from the government. And a lot of companies are put in a position where they almost had to choose between closing and compromising their integrity and principles. So it's,
here's, and I'll give you the example. Before the pandemic started, one of my favorite companies, and I would have bet you, if you had told me I was going to throw this company off the screen, I would have said impossible. One of my favorite companies was Qantas Airlines from Australia. Qantas had the best safety record of any airline. And if you've ever flown Qantas or dealt with them, as of the start of the pandemic, their operations were remarkable in terms of the quality of the management, the quality of the governance, the quality of the customer service. I mean, just a remarkable company. And the culture was wonderful. You get on a Qantas airline, and people are wonderful. It's just, I couldn't say enough good things about Qantas. Literally, Qantas then, and I'm sure it was government coercion, dictates that their pilots have to do something that could kill them, but which we know encourages clotting of blood. And that's, of course, the danger. Blood clots is a real danger for flying.
Yeah.
you can't do that because your business is safety,
Mm-hmm.
right? You are doing something. You get the wrong kind of blood clots on a flight, and you can have a plane crash and kill a couple hundred people,
Right.
right? That there is a point at which you need to say no. We refuse to do it. If the airlines had turned to the government and said no, we're responsible for safety, and we're not going to do that. We're not going to mandate this to pilots.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
which they would have probably gotten support from that, but who knows in the moment, because they were pretty, especially in Australia. But to that point, we've covered this a lot on the show in regard to, I mean, I called them vaxidents during the conversation, is that there was a rapid, very documented increase in traffic accidents after that time period, or it's not as to the same degree, but with plane accidents as well. And you really just can't deny that. But I think the problem was that a lot of the time maybe didn't even know that there was a risk, or that the government was telling them that there was no association with blood clots. It's just so convoluted. But I agree with you, and I think that this is where we have to be today, is to take that hard, principled stance. It's the only way we can get through this.
If when the pandemic started, I knew there was a risk of blood clots on these things.
Right.
Okay. And I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. But I had a lot of clients who had experienced vaccine injury and the lies of the medical community.
Long before the COVID vax, you're saying, and I agree.
Long before. If you look at how many, think about it. One of the great heroes of the pandemic were all the mothers who refused to back down and kept trying to warn everybody about how dangerous, how many people were being killed by vaccines.
Right.
They saved a lot of people during the pandemic. It was thanks to them that I knew. It took me many years of working with mothers dealing with, neurologically damaged kids from vaccines that helped me understand what was happening and how dangerous, this stuff could be. But certainly, helped me understand that the pharmaceutical industry was killing people.
Mm-hmm.
And medical malpractice is the third, before the pandemic started, was the third largest killer of people in America. And I think I just saw an email by John Rappaport predicting now it's number one.
It has to be. If we're being honest about the numbers, there's really no way around it. That was unprecedented,
Right.
And the great, as you call it, the great poisoning, which is way more than just the vaccine side of it. But that is an obvious point. Not to forget the relation to the reduction of life expectancy and what that did to the first point, kind of balancing that problem out. But so there's an interesting overlap to this, to the point we're going to get into around anti-capitalism and the conversation of Trump. Is it right there? You could make a point about the government overlap with a pharmaceutical product that's created by an independent company. And, there's a lot of these points. So let's get into that overlap and how this connects.
So I just want to go back because, I am a capitalist from way back. I grew up on Wall Street and investment banking, and I loved it. But capitalism, there's a very major line between capitalism and crime. Okay. And so capitalism, is when the society sets a set of rules. It's called justice. These are the rules we're going to play by. These are the rule by which we run our markets. These are how we're going to conduct ourselves. So you have a governance and a management system that sets the rules. And then capitalism is you compete fiercely within those rules, right? That's capitalism. When you say, I don't have to obey the rules, I'm above the law, and I'm just going to take people's stuff and I'm going to cheat and steal, we call that crime. Right?
Yeah.
And that's not capitalism. And, I feel Mahatma Gandhi once said, when asked about Western civilization, he said, I think we ought to try it. And I believe in America, I think we ought to try capitalism. I think capitalism could work really well. I think it could work better than technocracy plus organized crime.
Well, so just on a quick note, then how would you describe the current financial system, or what would you call what we're dealing with right now?
So we're dealing with a central bank reset. And this reset, the central banks reset the system every sort of 80 to 120 years is my read of things. And we're in what they got together in 2018 and looked at a plan from a group of central bankers working through the BlackRock Institute called Going Direct. And if you come to Solari, we have a great deal of information about the Going Direct reset. And so we're going to reset, but this reset is different than all the other resets, and I'll tell you why. It's very important. This reset, because of digital technology, they can literally end currency and implement a financial control grid, which is the equivalent of slavery. It's, if you look at why they canceled the African slave trade, it solves all the problems they had then that caused them to cancel it. And slavery, we know historically, is the most profitable business. So this gives them the ability to literally implement a complete control grid. And so it's the end of currency. And we've never seen that before. Resets, changes, flushes, moves the currency. But now we're talking about ending currency as we know it. It's quite remarkable. In other words, we are evolving from a central banking warfare model, with markets and capitalism, to a control grid that basically turns the, I use Whitney Webb's word, it turns the planet into a panopticon.
Right.
It's a prison.
Right. And one of the things I keep saying about that, and what that you just described there, is that pushes us into a place where, kind of what we were saying earlier, that our opinions, our thoughts, our constitutional rights, it's irrelevant at that point. It's beyond that.
Right.
And I think that's one of the reasons it's happening.
So we go from a status of human to a status of slave.
Yes. Yeah.
Basically, you're looking at mega rich versus everyone else. And mega rich is looking at this situation and saying, we want total central control. And so we want a slavery system. There'll be plenty of mind control, because slaves who don't know they're slaves are more profitable. But if you look at the system, it's designed to basically extract as much value from each person. So no one has any rights, and nobody has any right to, we have no human rights and no property rights.
You own nothing, and you've never been happier. It's
right.
the WEF plan, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, right. So overlapping this then with the point of Trump being anti-capitalist, or really what I would say is the best way to frame it largely is, we've talked about the kind of the two sides, fascism, communism, and sort of how there's very many overlaps to that very same thing. And we can see both happening on Biden and Trump's administration. And so the conversation tends to be that, they get called different things, but ultimately it seems the government has been guiding us in this very same direction. So the point, though, is that people would clutch their pearls at the argument that Donald Trump is somehow.
So let me show you how the game works.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I live an hour outside of Memphis, and Memphis has an absolutely horrible crime problem.
Mm-hmm.
And they've had a district attorney, I'm told, who basically let the criminals run free. Okay. Now, we know the criminals running free, to the extent they're doing narcotics trafficking or sex slave trafficking, it's not those criminals who are making all the money. The money's going upstairs, right?
Right.
Because you can't transact a dime in this financial system. It's all controlled by the banks. Okay. So the money's going upstairs. But anyway, so we have a DA who would prosecute. There's a wonderful senator from this area who's been trying to get that DA impeached, because what do you need? The crime rate is way too high in Memphis. Okay. And it's hurting property owners. It's hurting citizens. It's killing tourism. It's just bad. So,
mm-hmm.
But what do you need? You need a non-Soros financed DA. You need a real DA who's prosecuting crime,
right,
and not permitting crime to happen in the city. That's your solution. Okay. Now, hold that thought, because this is the ping pong of the uniparty. So we got one side of the uniparty promoting this, sort of allowing crime to ravage Memphis. So in comes Trump. And if you look at what happened in Chicago, Trump is basically saying, okay, well, ICE is going to drop in and round up people without warrants or evidence, and including U.S. citizens and their kids, and confiscate property freely. Now, why would ICE do that? ICE would do that because if you get pushback against ICE, it gives the president authority to drop in the military, right? He's allowed to drop in military to protect ICE and ICE facilities, right?
Is he, though? Well, I'll come back to that, though. Go ahead.
Okay, well, let's just assume, he can have standing. What he doesn't have standing to do is drop in the National Guard or the military to deal with local crime. Right. That's the mayor's job, the police job. Okay. But if he can cook up a pushback against ICE, now, somebody said, oh, well, look at what ICE did, in Portland, in June. And my attitude was, really, who financed it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is a theater. And you've got, so I was having a debate with somebody from Memphis the other day. No, they were from the other side of Tennessee, but we're talking about Memphis. And they said, I would be happy for the president to drop military into Memphis to stop crime. Okay. And I said, pointing to what happened in Chicago, what about the rights of the people in Memphis? And she said, they have no rights until they're in prison. Okay. Now, what this does is say no warrants, no due process, no effort to determine whether somebody's a citizen or an immigrant.
Right.
Okay. So let's talk about the precedent. What we're saying is, I can arrest somebody with no warrant. I can, if you look at what's going on in California, I can hold them for 37 days at great expense of the taxpayer with no warrant and no identification and no due process. So no evidence, no warrant, no due process, right? And I can put them in prison. And the basis upon which I can do this is because I say they're a domestic terrorist.
Right.
So if I say you're let's say you have 100 acres of farmland I want for my data center.
Oh, good point.
I just say you're a terrorist, and then no warrant, no due process. I can go arrest you, put you in prison, and confiscate your property, all because I say you're a terrorist.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We're talking the plunder game.
Right.
Right? And what this person didn't understand, they were arguing to set a precedent that was going to be used to target them and take their property.
Right.
And they didn't understand that. And they said to me, you don't like Trump? I said, this has nothing to do with Trump.
Right. Exactly. It's always
you're watching a theater, the Soros DA, and dropping the military in and setting a precedent that we can come and arrest you because we say you're a terrorist and take your property. That's a precedent for the plunder team. And you're getting played by the theater. You're getting squeezed by the theater to fall in the trap to support it.
right. And just to broaden it out a touch, it's more than just that specific point, as you would argue as well. It can be used in any other way. We want to suppress your speech because you're a terrorist. We want to anything they want to. The point is that if he jumps to that terrorism claim, like the U.S. government's been doing all over the world, they can essentially argue that that's national security and they can do whatever they want, which is the larger point. It's everywhere you look.
Right. And so I'm sitting there talking to this wonderful, well-educated, wealthy person who is helping to build the plunder machinery and precedents that will take her assets.
Right.
I'm like, don't you see the game?
Do you think that's because she believed that somehow Trump is not going to do that to her? Or she doesn't have the foresight to see that the next Democratic administration could do the same? I mean, I don't understand how smart people can fall into that trap.
So we should talk about that. But here's the thing. The first thing you have to understand is that all of the organized crime in this country is centrally controlled. A soccer mom cannot back the drug dealer out of the neighborhood because he works for Tony Soprano, who finances James Bond. Right?
Right.
Okay. And the business is very centralized. So if there are criminal gangs dealing drugs in Memphis, they are not running that business. They are on a chain of command, and the money is flowing upstairs. That's what you have to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who control that business can turn it on and off whenever they want. Right?
Right.
So first of all, you've got to see the game. And the reality is, the things that are destroying your city or destroying Memphis, are centrally organized and controlled. And if you want to push back on the third rail, you've got to bring transparency to that, and you've got to deal with that and not get ping pong back and forth in the uniparty game.
Right. And then back to the point, I know you've got limited time. So at the seizing of land or any other way they would do that brings back to that point that it's sort of an illusion about the capital. So the way you're framing that, would you argue that both the uniparty is where would you frame that in the scale from capitalism, communism, fascism? How would you frame
there's a real competition in the uniparty, and that is who gets the right to grift and steal this year.
Mm-hmm. Well, I thought it was very interesting that, for example, that Trump and so did Biden, by the way, classified anti-capitalism as a political, pre-crime.
Trump is going
to
jail. If that's a crime, Trump's going to jail.
Yeah.
I've never met a more anti-capitalist. He is our most anti-capitalist president yet.
How interesting. Now, again, do you think that's just because this is the time in which that's supposed to happen, but that's his way, the way he sees it? Like, is it his opinion? Is that what he believes?
Let's go back to the mega rich versus everything else.
Mm-hmm.
You have Bibi Netanyahu running all over the Middle East, according to Tucker Carlson, telling people that he controls America.
Yeah, that's not new. Yeah.
Right. So I think if you look at the syndicate that's doing Gaza, they see Gaza as near success, and they're ready to do Europe and the United States.
Mm.
And you've got to get a digital ID, you've got to get programmable money, and you've got to get enough shredding of the Constitution so that you're free to rock and roll. So if you want to bring Gaza to America, it's digital ID, programmable money, and compromise of the constitutional protections on due process. And First Amendment, Second Amendment, you're trying to shred the Constitution, and you're trying to get the MAGA group to support you in doing that.
Right. It's just the slowly eroding this, or rather just creating the justification for people to call for their own subjugation. And that's kind of the same point. I don't, why anybody can't see that next step, especially since historically this has always seemed to teeter-totter back and forth. I mean, this is where I come to the point where
here's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
We always come through one of the elections, and people get their hopes up about things which are not, they get false hopes, and they don't want to let it go because it makes life unbearable if they have to give up their false hope.
Yeah.
And so you get a false hope that someone in the White House here's the thing. That machinery is centralized and controlled. The reason that Solari has invested so much time and effort in working with the states is because there's still more latitude at the states, and the states have lots of power under the Constitution. So, and that's why Israel just took 250 state legislators, to Israel. Now they're working the states too. So there is something that can still be done. And, part of getting people distracted by the uniparty at the federal level is you want to keep them on the couch and entertained and away from pushing back on the third rail. Okay.
Red circuses, yeah.
Right. So here's the thing. If we want to have a revolution tomorrow, imagine by the end of the year, if we could get 50% of the people in the country using cash.
Mm-hmm.
You can't implement a digital control grid. Let's say everybody in Tennessee and the states where you can do this, 45 states, goes back into their DMV and says, I don't want a real ID on my license. Either I don't travel internationally or I'll get a passport, or I don't fly, I'll get a passport. And 50% using cash, and not only using cash, but using that cash to buy fresh, nutritious food that makes them strong and vital and healthy.
On the local farm.
On the local farm, and finding the local health practitioners that they can trust so they don't go to the hospital and get euthanized, unexpectedly. So there's a great deal we can do. And it's that if we see clearly this is the mega rich versus everyone else, forget Donald Trump. If we made Ryan Christian the president of the United States, you would find yourself in the Oval Office with basically guns pointed at your head, that if you don't help the criminal syndicate, you'll be shot or your family will be shot, right? Mm-hmm. So that's not a solution.
Right.
And it's not, if you went into the Oval Office tomorrow and your hands were tied, I would still love you because you're great, right? But you can't, it doesn't matter how much I like Ryan Christian, there's nothing he can do. Right?
Which is exactly why I think the point would be that at least I would speak for myself, I wouldn't end up in that position because we know that, right? So the point you're making is there's other ways to make a difference and change things than going through the broken political system.
Well, but here's the thing. We control. If we push back on the third rail, they can't implement the digital control grid.
I agree.
That's the little secret here. Don't get lost in the theater. We have the power to change this.
100%. And
Yeah,
I really do think,
but you have to get back. You got to get off the couch,
Mhm.
and you have to start using cash, and you have to say, I'm going to make sure my family is healthy and my family is well. And you got to do those things. You got to take responsibility to learn about food and learn about health and let go of the old system. I don't know if you remember the woman who was questioning me at Crossing Creek Farm this weekend.
Mhm.
So she described the fact that she'd been in the traditional model and then had discovered, she had listened to Solari and all of us and discovered, oh, wait, I got to get out of this box and get into a healthy model. And she
Right.
and her family changed their whole lives. And look how beautiful and healthy they look.
Right. And then I just love the message there, right? I mean, that, everybody out there doing this as well, it's like, you don't realize how many people's lives you change just by acting with integrity and giving people information to follow up on, so that's,
Right.
you save that person's life, it's powerful. But,
Right.
I think that's the message really is that, don't think that and a lot of times we can have these conversations and people walk away going like, oh, we're doomed. And it's like the exact opposite message.
No,
It's dangerous, but we can absolutely do something about this. And I really do believe that.
walk out of the theater and start
Yep.
living.
Exactly.
Walk out of the theater. If you stay in the theater, we're doomed. If you walk out of the theater and start, building the world we want to live in, we're fine.
I agree.
Right.
Well, I'll leave it there since I'm sure we have not much time left, and I'll let you. Anything else you want to shout out before we go? I'll have one more last thing to say, and then we can wrap up today.
No, just, I have to tell you, it was great seeing you because you look great. So you've been spending a lot of time out there with the squash and the watermelon. It's been really good for you.
Thank you. I mean, it's amazing how I've gardened my whole life, but like the last couple of years, it really has, I've gone real far with it. And it's not over the top to say it's changed my life, in very positive ways. And so I just can't say enough for people to get out there and put your feet in the grass, stand outside, and you'll quickly realize the world may not be as crazy as you might think it is every day on social media, but I'll leave just with a couple examples to overlapping this with, interesting. And there's so many of these, from Nvidia to Intel to Trump screaming at Fox News to get on board or get off, like to show you that there's a lot more that's, capitalist is very much not what we're looking at here. And I think that the point is that there's more that, we're dealing with a government, a uniparty that absolutely is using this ping pong back and forth to keep us distracted while this is finishing. And we both obviously agree here that this is not something that we can sit back and allow, that we can absolutely change this with our actions, with our words, with our integrity, with our principles. So thank you, Catherine, as always, for informing us.
Thank you, Ron. You have a great day.
You too. And I'll see you next time. As always, everybody out there, question everything, come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.